Welcome to the fifth video in this series, A Beginner's Guide to Rails 7. In this video, we're going to be adding user authentication. So user authentication is verifying that a person is who they say they are, and we're going to use a password to do that. So a user will come to our site, they'll create an account with a password, and to verify that it's the same person coming back to our site, they have to give us back their password. Now, that's authentication. Authorization is making sure that the user, now that we know who they are and we know that it's really them, authorization is making sure that they have permission to perform that action. Now we're going to do both of those in this video. Our authorization code is going to be very simple, but if it gets more complex, there is like a plugin or a Ruby gem that we can use to manage our authorization. Now authentication, we're going to use a local strategy, meaning we're going to use a password. In the next video, we'll explore federated logins, and those are logins like through Google or Facebook or something like that. We're going to use another site to authenticate users. And we have a couple of options to build our authentication. We could use a plugin or a gem called Devise, and that will manage our authentication. And the advantage with that is it's built with security experts. There are security people that work on this gem to fix any security holes there are, or we could build our own. And luckily, Rails adds in a lot of features to make this really easy. And of course, Rails has some security experts working for them. You just got to make sure you follow the right policies, and then you should be okay as far as security is. And this is kind of a trade-off whether you want to customize something like Devise. It'll do your authentication, but then you might spend a lot of work at customizing it versus building your own. We just build it from scratch. And Rails actually makes it pretty easy to build it from your own, so we're going to do that. So the goal at the end of this video will be to have a separate task list for each user. So the users will come visit their site, they'll create an account, log in, and they'll be able to create their own tasks. So to get started, let's create a user model. And we'll do that with the generator, just like how we created a task model. So we'll use the generator that generates us a model for users, which will be the name of the model. And remember, you want to use the singular name here. And each user will have a name, email, and a password. Now, the way that Ruby does passwords is that we're going to create a field called Password Digest. So I'll talk more about that in a little bit. All of these are going to be strings or varchars database types, so we don't need to put any types on there. And if you want to add additional fields, say like a phone number or an address or whatever else, you can add additional fields here as well. So go ahead and run that, and then we'll migrate our database. So in order to use Rails built-in password encryption, we're going to have to uncomment this gem bcrypt. Bcrypt is what's going to encrypt our password when we save it into our database. And when we add a new gem, we need to quit our server, and then run bundle install to install that gem. And then we can use foreman to start our server up again after the gem's been installed. Now in the user model file that was generated, I went ahead and added some validations. First of all, to make sure they do have a name when they create their account. And also with their email, I'm making sure that the email has an @ sign in it. Now you could use a more sophisticated regular expression, but a lot of times those more sophisticated regular expressions really limit valid passwords from getting entered in. So I'm just doing something simple and just making sure that their email has an @ sign in it. And that will allow all valid emails. It might allow some invalid emails, but we'll let the user worry about that if they use an email that's not valid. So to be able to store our password securely in the database, all we have to do is put has secure password, or call this method here inside of this the user class, and that will add in a password and a password confirmation onto the field. This also requires that we have a password digest field, which I did when we created our user model. Now, before we go ahead and start creating our user interface with a sign-up form for users to create accounts, let's go ahead and play with users in the console. So we can go ahead and create a new user. Now, it's important to know that this user only exists in memory. They're not saved in the database yet. And you can see that it just has the name, email, and that password digest field that I mentioned before. Now, if you notice, we're not going to save the password itself in the database. Instead, we're only going to save an encrypted version of the password in the database. And there's no way to take that encrypted version and regenerate the password. We could just verify if passwords are correct or incorrect using this password digest. So let's see how that works. We could go u.name equals Fred, and then u.email equals fred@test.com. And then first of all, if we go u.save, if we try to save this user in the database, it's going to say false. So let's figure out what errors are there. And it's basically saying the password is blank. So this has secure password is automatically going to require that a password be set if we try to save this user in the database. Remember, there is not a password field in our database, but we can set a password. So this will be our password right here. And then let's go ahead and try to set the password confirmation. But let's say that we actually get it wrong, so the passwords don't match when they're trying to create the account. And then we'll go ahead and try to save this user in the database. And again, we get false. So let's see what errors we have. So we can see that we have an error on the password confirmation field, and that's because the two passwords don't match. So the has secure password makes sure that the two passwords, the password and the confirmation, match. So let's go ahead and fix that error. We'll say user.password confirmation equals secret. So they do match, and now we'll do u.save. And we could see that the user is now saved in the database. Let's go ahead and print out this user again. And you can see the password digest, it says filtered right here. And that's because the Rails logs will filter all of the passwords just to make sure that nobody can get them. In fact, our passwords will only ever exist in memory. We'll never save them on a hard drive or into the database or anything to keep our passwords secure. But we can see the password digest if we say password digest. And this is our password digest right here. And normally you wouldn't want to print that out, but this is what bcrypt generated. And this includes both a salt and the hash that it made. Now, you might want to read it up a little bit more on salting passwords. It just makes the passwords a little bit more secure. And we store this digest in the database. So this is what gets stored in the database. But it's really hard to get back to our original password, secret, from this digest. There's really no way to do it other than to start guessing passwords. Now you can see that the password is still stored on this user right now, but that's because we're dealing with the same user in memory. If we get the user out of the database, and so I just reloaded that user out of the database, and now if I say user.password, this way it says nil, so the password isn't set. So you can see the passwords only exist in memory. And by the way, when Rails responds to a request, these user objects, after it's done responding to the request, get deleted out of memory. So the password gets deleted with that, and then there's no way to get it back other than to know the password. Now with the password digest, though, we can verify if a password is correct or incorrect. So we can say u.authenticate is a method, and let's say that we get the wrong password. It'll return us false because it knows it's wrong. And if we happen to get the right password, it'll return us the user object that we have, and that's a true value. So we could say in our code, we could say if a user authenticate and pass in a password guess, and if they get it right, then it will say true, and this is obviously wrong, so it's going to say no. Now that we know how our user model works, it's time to create the user interface. And the first thing we'll create is a sign up form, which is the exact same thing that we did with tasks, which is create a form to create a user instead of a form to create a task, and we'll call that the sign up page. So we'll go ahead and use the generator to generate us a controller, and we'll call this the user's controller. And we'll have a new action associated with that. So after we generated that controller, the generator created a route for that new action, and we instead will use the resources that use the RESTful routing built into Rails. Now, just to note, we can add exceptions for different routes that we don't want to use. For example, maybe the index route, this will be a page that lists out all of our users. I don't want that page because I don't want a page the users can visit to see all of the other users. But maybe in some other sites, you might want that page. So you can remove routes that you don't want using this accept clause. Now, using RESTful routing, the sign-up form would be at users/new. And if we want this URL to be different, we can do that in the routes file. So instead of using that new/user/new, we can do a named route for our sign-up page. And that's just a personal preference if you want it to be a little more standard URL. So we can have a GET request that goes to sign up, and that would go to the user's new action. Now we can see that we have the sign up route, and that goes to the user's new action. So now we just need a form to create a new user. So we're going to go through this really quick because it's the exact same thing we did for tasks. In the controller, under the new action, we're going to create a user, just a new user. And then in the new view for users, we just add a form that looks almost like the task form, but it has the fields for a user instead, a name, email, password, and a password confirmation. Now, if you want, you can change the label that shows up on the form. Instead of saying password confirmation, we can have it say confirm password instead. By the way, in the Bootstrap Form Gems documentation, you can read about different options like this label that you can use on your fields. So we're going to do a create action almost exactly like our task, except we're going to use users here. And when we save the user, we're going to redirect them to the root path, at least for now, with a notice saying they successfully signed up. And if it is unable to save, we'll just re-render the new form. Of course, we have our user params down here in the private area. That's going to require that there be a user and permit the name, email, and password. So let's test all of this out. We'll just try signing up someone, and there are no errors here, or there are lots of errors here, so we have to have a name. So we'll sign up, we already signed up Fred on the terminal, so we'll sign up Bob, and Bob at test.com, and we'll include a password and a password confirmation. And you can see that that worked, but I intentionally messed up the password, so it should have said that I needed to fix the password confirmation. So let's look in our logs and see what happened. And we can see here in the logs that we have this SQL statement that is actually inserting the user into the database, but up here in red, we have this unpermitted parameter password confirmation. So the password confirmation was actually whitelisted from our request because it's not in our permit list. And the way that has secure password works is if you just have a password, it doesn't bother to check the password confirmation. So we actually need to include password confirmation in our permitted list. That way it can check to make sure that the passwords do match. So I kind of want to emphasize that these names right here that we're permitting have to be the same names that we are using in our form that allows the user to set them. If we miss a name that's in our form, then the permit down here will eliminate that name out of the assignment when we go to create our new user up here. So if another tricky thing that could happen is, let's say that we accidentally misspell one of these permits. Let's see what happens. So we'll go ahead and try to sign up Mary. And we can see that password can't be blank. Now this will be really confusing. Hey, I put a password there. Why is it blank? And again, looking at our logs, we could see that we have an unpermitted parameter password. So when we see this and we're like, well, wait, we have password here, but now it's time to really make sure that you spelled it correctly. And that is why it's not working. So now, hopefully, if we have different passwords when we sign up here, we can see that the password doesn't match. And we can make sure that we get the correct password in both fields, and it works. Now that we have users created, it's time to work on allowing users to log in. And with that, we need a login form, which means that we're going to need to create new actions. Now we could add those actions into our users controller, but we're going to do something different. And if we think of the login status as a session, when a user logs in, they're creating a session, and when they log out, they're destroying the session. So what we'll do is we'll just create a new controller, and we don't need a model because we're going to use cookies and the Rails sessions to be able to store the information. That's the model. So we'll call this the sessions controller, and we need a new action on that one. And once again, we don't want this this route in here that the generator generated for us. And we're going to use RESTful routing with our sessions as well. But this time, we don't need an index action. We also don't need an edit because there's no way to edit whether you're logged in or not. You're either going to log in or log out. We also don't, so we don't need an edit or an update. In fact, all we need is our new and our create and our destroy. And we also don't need our show because there's going to be no page that shows your logged in status. It's going to be throughout our full site. And instead of using /session/new as our URL, let's do the same thing we did with our sign up link, and let's just have a login link that goes to our new action. And so we don't need a new action on this one as well. But when we go to /login, you'll see that we're on the sessions new page. And since we don't have an actual model backing this controller, there's really nothing we need to do in this new action except for create the new view, which will have a form to log in. So we'll just replace this with the form. Now this time, the login form, we don't have a model like we did with the users controller or the tasks. Instead, we just need to make a post request to the sessions path, and that will call the create action in the sessions controller. And we just need an email and password. And since there isn't a model, there's no way that we can display errors here, but we'll display errors in a different way. So back in our sessions controller, we'll go ahead and create the create action. And the first thing we want to do is find a user whose email matches the email that they submitted in the form. And since there isn't a model, like in the users controller and in the task controller, we can just get that out with the params email. And we're going to go get the first one. So we're assuming that there's only one user that has this email. Now I realized when we created the user model, we didn't make sure that that was true, but we can add a validation called uniqueness equals true. And what that will do is if we try to create another account with bob@test.com, we've already created an account like that, we'll see that the email has already been taken. So now we'll check if there is a user with that email, because there might not be a user with that email, and if the user.authenticate, and this is the method I showed you in the console, we'll pass in the password guess that they have. And this will return true if their guess is correct. So here we want to log in the user. And if not, what we can do is we can redirect to the login path with a alert saying invalid email or password. Now, the reason why I'm saying invalid email or password is I'm not going to let them know if they happen to get the email right, but the password wrong, because then a hacker might I say, okay, now I know that there's a user with this email. Now I can just try a bunch of passwords. So they won't even know if they got a correct user or not. And now if we go into the login page, I can see that I'm getting an error and it's highlighting this invalid method sessions path. And I think that should be valid. And you can see right here in my resources, I forgot an S there on the session. So if I fix that and I refresh, that error goes away. So let's go ahead and try to log in Bob, and I'll get that email, the password wrong. You can see invalid email or password. And if we try to log in some email that doesn't exist, we get the same thing. So now we need to decide what it means to be logged in. And what we're going to do is Rails has this session hash where you can add in any data you want. So we'll just store the user ID in this session hash, and it's just user.id. So what it means to be logged in is that there is a user ID set in the session. Now, after we log them in, we better respond to the request. So we want to redirect them to the root path, and we can just do a notice logged in. And so now we'll try to log in Fred, and Fred is the user that we created in the console. And let's see if I can get his password correct. And sure enough, it says logged in. But after we get rid of this thing, there's nothing to indicate that Fred is actually logged in. So let's work on that next. And how we're going to do that is we're going to change the links up here. If they're not logged in, we'll have a login link and a sign up link up here. And if they are logged in, we'll have a log out link. So I'm going to get rid of this search bar and put login and log out links. So now in my layouts file, I have this form, and that's the search bar. I'm going to get rid of this and replace it with login and log out links. So you can see that we have a UL with some navbar nav in here, and we added a login link and a sign up link. And because this is using Flex, this should show up on the right side of our navigation bar. And refreshing, sure enough, we have our login and sign up. But Fred is already logged in, so we don't want to see these buttons. We want to see a log out button. So now in here, we ask if there's something set as the user ID, then show a logout link, else show login and sign up links. And refreshing, we can see we have this logout link, which we need to work on next. Now, the logout would usually be a destroy action on this session's resource. But to make the link a lot easier to make, we'll just have it do a get request, because a destroy requires a delete request, which requires creating a form with a button in it. So instead, we'll just take the easy way out and have logout go to sessions destroy. So now we don't need the destroy as one of the routes that gets mapped with this resources. In fact, the only route that is getting mapped is the create action. So instead of logout just being a hashtag link, we'll call this the logout path. And back in the sessions controller, all we have to do to log someone out is set that user ID to nil, and then redirect them to the root path with a notice saying they're logged out. And so now when we click the logout link, first we have to refresh our page so we get the right logout link. When we click it, we see that we're logged out, and now we have login and sign up buttons or links. Now, one thing that we might want to do is after a user creates his account, we probably don't want them to get redirected to the root path and not be logged in. We probably want to log him in, so we should set the user ID right after we were able to save them in the database. But now we kind of have a little bit of a problem, or it will become a problem in the future, is our login and logout logic is mixed between different controllers. We have the user controller that's setting the user ID here, and then we also have the session controller that's using it here and here. It would be nice to unify this, because maybe if we decide to change it from user ID to something else, then we'd have to go throughout all of the places in our site where we use this. So it would be great to centralize this all in one place. So inside of our application controller, and this is the parent controller of all of our classes, we can go ahead and create a private section here. And that means that these won't be actions that we can call through the web, but now we can go ahead and create a login and a logout method here, and then we can call them from our other controllers. So we'll create the login and logout methods, and then in our sessions controller, instead of doing this manually, we'll just call the login and pass in that user that was just created or that just logged in. And then here we'll just call the logout method. And in the users controller, instead of setting that there, we'll call it the login method and pass in the user that was just created. So let's test that all out. Let's go ahead and sign up George. And we can see that he successfully signed up and we are logged in. And now we can log him out and we can go ahead and try to log George back in. And he's logged in. Now we still have the problem right here where we're still using the session ID, and that's not in the same location in our application controller as our login and our logout. And what we can do instead is create a method that will give us the user that's logged in, and we'll call that current user. Now, if the current user is nil, that means nobody is logged in. And if it's not nil, that means it is a user, and we can actually use that user like as they create tasks. We can add that user as the owner of the task and so on. So this will be a really good method to create. And let's create that method in the application controller, and we'll call it current user. And what we want to do is if there is a session or a user ID in the session, then we will return user.find the user with that session. And else we can return nil. Now, we don't really need this else because it will automatically return nil. Now, the only problem with this is we might use current user several times. Maybe we'll print the user that's logged in's name up in the navigation bar, and then we'll show them in different spots, and we might connect them to tasks. So we would be hitting the database every time we do this current user. So what we'd want to do is cache the current user. And the way we can do that is we can go at current user equals this, and then we can do some more if statements saying if there is a current user, return it. Else, if there's a user in the session ID, we'll go ahead and cache that and we'll return it. Now, Ruby doesn't have required that you put return statements there. It'll always return the last statement that's run. So we're going to return the current user no matter what. Unless there isn't a current user and a session ID, then we'll return nil. Now, this 4 lines of code can actually be condensed into 1 line of code. Okay, so the first thing is a canceling if statement. So if the session ID is not present, then we're just going to return nil, and that's what this canceling if statement does at the end. Now, at the beginning, if current user actually exists, if it's been set, we'll return current user, and this is an OR. If it's not set, then we'll find the user out of the database, set it, and return it. So this is quite a lot of stuff happening in 1 line of code. Now we might want to call current user in our controllers. Notice we called login and logout in our controllers, but we know that we want to call this in our view because that's where our application layout file, this file is our view. And in order to be able to call this in our view, we just have to put a helper method. We just have to indicate that this is also a helper method. So this allows us to call the current user in our controllers, and this allows us to call this method in our views. And refreshing, we can see that George is still logged in. Now we could create a little link here so that George can edit his account or go to his account preferences. And so now in the view, we can create a link that goes to the user. The link will say the user's name, and this goes to the user path, which will be the show view and the user's controller. Now, hopefully you can also see why we want to cache that current user, because if we didn't cache it, this would query our database to get the current user out. and then we'd query the database again to get his name, and then we'd query it one more time to create the path for that current user. But since we have cached that in our cache that as the @current user, then we only hit the database once. And refresh, we have a link to see George's profile. And I'm not going to show this in this video, but you can go ahead and create a show view for the user just like you did for tasks. Now, along with changing the login and logout links when someone's logged in, we can also show and hide this tasks link. That way, but users that are not logged in can't go and see any tasks because now the tasks are going to belong to a specific user that logged in. So you can see even when we refresh, we still see this task links when George is logged in, but if we log him out, the tasks disappear. However, that's only part of the problem because that doesn't prevent a user from just typing something into the URL and getting to the tasks. So now we're getting into the authorization part of this video. We know who the user is, and we know it's the same person that signed up because they were able to validate their password. But now we need to authorize, does this user have permission to view certain things? And now we're going to say all users can view tasks. But we need to create a method just in case a user isn't logged in to stop them from viewing the task. And we'll call that the authorize or authenticate method. And we're calling it authenticate because we want to make sure the user is authenticated. So even though we're writing authorization logic, authenticated users are authorized to see tasks. So if you notice, I'm doing this in the application controller, so I can reuse this method in all of my controllers. And we could say if not current user, which means there isn't someone logged in, we'll just redirect the user to the root path and give an alert of an invalid request. And that means that whenever the user tries to access something that they shouldn't, then we'll redirect them to the root path. And now we can use this method in a before action filter. Anything that we don't want users to be able to see unless they're logged in, we can call this method and it will redirect them if they're not logged in. And the first place we might want to use this authenticate method is in the user's controller, not for the sign up form, which is the new action, or to create a user. Of all the other actions, we probably want them to be logged in. It doesn't make sense to view a profile unless we know who the user is. Of course, you don't want them anybody editing and updating a user unless they're already logged in as that user. So we can just do this before action authenticate, except for these two actions that I've implemented. If you implement other actions like a show, edit, update, and delete actions here, then they will be protected, so only logged in users can use them. So if we go up to the URL and we try to type in users1, and this is the show action, of course, I haven't developed that. Instead of actually seeing the profile, they'll be redirected to the root path. Now we can do that for this before action, or at least in the task controller. We can protect all actions inside of here because in order to access any tasks, we want the user to be logged in. If we go to the tasks URL and we just try to type that in, we see that I misspelled a redirect to in that method. So back in the application controller, I just forgot an R there. And refreshing one more time, you can see we're on the root path saying invalid request. A user can't just show up without signing in and go to view our tasks. They have to log in first. And so I logged in George off camera, and now he can see the tasks, so that's working. Now, if we wanted all these tasks to be shared amongst all of our users, this is working great. But we want each user to have their own tasks, meaning when George clicks on this, he should only see his tasks and he shouldn't see the tasks of other users. So how we're going to do that is set up a one-to-many relationship like we did in the previous video. So again, we're responsible to set up the right schema to make this one-to-many relationship work. And in order for users to own tasks, there has to be a user ID on the task model. So we can use the generator to generate us a migration only. We already have the models, we just need to change a table. So this will add a user ID to the task table, and if we name it like this, Rails is smart enough to pick up that it's the tasks table that we want to modify, and it will go ahead and add a user ID to that. So when we run this, again, it only generates us a migration, and we can view that migration in the DB migrate folder. And you can see we're going to add a column to the task table called user ID. So let's go ahead and run that migration. And we can see that the column has been added. Now, since the task table is the one that has the foreign key, he is the one that gets the belongs to in his model class. And remember, this is just adding on some nice variables onto these models so that we can access the associated models really easy. So tasks now belongs to a user. And then in the user's model, he now has many tasks. All right, now I want to do something with all the tasks that are currently created in the database, because right now there's no user that owns them. So I want to modify them so that the first user owns them. But to be able to do that a little bit easier, I need to change this validation method. Right now their due dates are in the past, so that I can't update the task and then save it into the database without changing the due date. So I think it's okay that users can edit tasks that have already passed their due date. So I just added another little check to say if only validate the due date if we're not saved in the database, if we're a brand new task. So we'll go ahead and jump into our console, and the first thing I'll do is I'll say, I'll get the first user out of our database, and I believe this is Fred that we created in the console. So we have that user, and then we could say task.all.each, and we're going to loop through them. So for each task, we're going to say t.user equals u, which is Fred that we got out of the database. And then we'll go t.save with an exclamation mark. What that means is if validations fail, that we should crash instead of just return false. So I want to make sure all these new users get saved in the database, and then we'll just end that loop. And you can see that we went through and we updated all of those users, and now their user ID is equal to 1. So Fred is now the owner of the tasks that have already been created. And so still though, if we refresh, we still see all of the tasks on this page, even though George, who doesn't own these tasks, is logged in. And that's because in the controller, we're still getting all the tasks out. But because we know that a user is logged in, we know that instead of loading all the tasks, we can just get the current user, this is the user that's logged in, ask for all of his tasks, and that will get only the tasks that belong to the user that's logged in. And so now if we refresh, we can see that George doesn't have any tasks yet. Let's go ahead and log out, and then we'll log in Fred, and we'll see Fred's tasks, and now Fred has all of these tasks. Okay, so now I'm going to log back in George, and of course George doesn't have any tasks, but what if George tries to add IDs onto the top of the URL, and we can see that task number 3 that is in the database is able to view that task. And that's no good because George does not own this task. And that's because when we load the task out in this method down here, we just load any task out. But we should probably protect that and say, just take the current user's tasks and only look for those. So now when we refresh, we see that we got record not found. Now this looks like an error message, but again, in production mode, this will just be a page not found error. So George will know not to mess with the IDs because it's not going to get anybody else's tasks. But now when George creates a task in here, we want to make sure that he's the one that owns it. And we can do that by just saying at task, the new task that we're going to create, we're going to assign the user to be the user that is logged in. So the logged in user will be the user that owns the task. So now if the user goes to the task link, he can go ahead and create a new task, and he can say, I own this task. And we'll go ahead and do a due date into the future sometime. And we could see that this time George owns this task. And now when George visits the task link, he can see that this is his task, and they're separate from Fred's tasks. There's still one security hole that we have to shore up. Of course, George cannot see Fred's tasks, and we get this record not found. But what happens when he tries to see that task's notes? And now he can see the notes for a task that's owned by Fred. And that's because in the notes controller, we are loading the task out here, but we're loading any task out, and that's independent of who's logged in. So we probably want to load that out by the current user and make sure that we find his tasks instead of other tasks that aren't there. The other thing is all of these notes, that we shouldn't be even accessing the notes unless we're logged in. So we also want to add a before action here that authenticates the user, that makes sure that we have logged in users before they can access the notes controller. With those two changes, when we try to refresh, now we get the record not found, and this will protect the notes from being accessed by users that don't own them. So now this is all in my model, the way that I want this website to work, but you do have some options. You could have it be that you can see everybody's tasks, but maybe the tasks are still owned by the person who created them. So you might be able to see everybody's tasks, but down here you'd have an author field, and it would print the name of the user that created the task. So there are other options with your security. You could let tasks be seen by the entire world, but make sure that somebody logs in first before they create, edit, or update a task. You can also make sure that everybody can see a task, but if you're going to edit this task down here, then you can only edit it if you own it, or if you happen to be an admin. So you can implement your own authorization code depending on how you want your website to work. So that's all I'm going to do in this video. In the next video, as I said at the beginning, we're going to work on a federated login, which will allow us to use some services like Facebook or Google, and we're going to actually use GitHub so that people can log in without creating their own password.